Good morning, thrill seekers. Thanks, Dana, and folks here at the Columbia Museum of Art. I'm really excited to be here and talk with you about this topic. It's not a small topic. What couldn't you talk about, really, under that heading? Big topic, also kind of a vexing one, because gender has to do with desire. It seems basic, kind of fundamental to who we are. And yet, at the same time, whom among us has not felt it as an imposition? To be ladylike, to act like a man, this requires years of training and no small effort. So on its own, gender names both something that feels innate and also norms to which we feel obliged to conform. Adding film to gender narrows this just a little bit, maybe tilting to the normative pole. You might be expecting me to focus on conventional ways of representing gender rather than how we feel about our own genders. So the social side more than the individual side. And I will focus in that way. Yet it's also true that audiences do not regularly perceive movies as imposing gender, as urging conformity. If we received films as stern lessons on how to act ladylike or how to act like a man, we would probably stop buying tickets, because that doesn't sound like very much fun. Unless we're masochists, which has been one theory. Let's hold off on that and work with the idea that gender on screen is simultaneously a social imposition and what we want to see. Film is one of the ways our society gets us to internalize a set of norms such that we do not feel like they come from the outside. Rather, we feel them as our own. This may be the case even, or maybe even especially, when we do not feel normal. That is, for some, the uncomfortable or thrilling feeling of deviance may arise in reference to the very same set of screen conventions that for others provides the security of normalcy. So gender in film names a profound, intriguing, and multifaceted puzzle, one I'm probably not going to get all cleared up for you today. Instead, I'm going to do what professors do and break it down into more manageable parts. These parts. Between part 1 and part 2, I've structured in some audience participation, figuring you'd be about this size of crowd. So steel yourself for that. If you were planning to nap, maybe save it for the second 2 parts. So, starting with on-screen representation. Here you see a stock photo that's included with Apple's Keynote application. I was about to replace it with a frame grab from a film, but then I thought this works as well as anything for the first couple points one would want to make. How would you describe the genders you see here? Would you say masculine and feminine, man and girl, daughter and father? So the first point is there are a few ways to describe this, thus more than 2 genders. Second point, gender conventions reverberate or ramify through every aspect of the image. Apple's marketing and design team surely picked this photo with particular consumers in mind, moms or dads who were nudged to replace this image with their own equally happy and wholesome photos. What are the markers of wholesomeness? That clean prairie landscape, for one, so important to the image of American possibility. But gender is also important to that wholesome feeling. In your mind's eye, dress these people differently. For example, how about putting Dad in that Casanova costume? See how easy it is to take the wholesomeness out of the picture and put playfulness, perversity, something else in its place. How the actors are posed and framed also matters, obviously. The way they look into the camera is particularly important to give a feeling of a happy family snapshot. If we mentally pivot the actors' heads towards one another and have them stare soulfully into one another's eyes in an approximation of a familiar Hollywood image, but without recasting the little girl and the man, then we have something that looks either ironic and playful or perverse and maybe appalling. So to recap these basic points, preview. On screen, we encounter more than two genders. There are conventions for representing them. These conventions involve features of the image like costume, posture, and framing. They also include or interact with features of the image that might not seem so strongly gendered, like setting. Often the point of representing gender is not to represent gender per se, but to convey some other feeling like wholesomeness or happiness. By means of familiar conventions, we can swiftly recognize configurations of gender that seem normal, as distinct from those that seem playful or perverse. Let's linger on the first of these points just a bit. How we should parse the multiplicity of genders is a matter that involves some conceptual friction. Some of you may be thinking, for instance, that those multiple genders are still pretty easy to sort into just two piles. So let's look into this a bit more closely. If we think of the gender difference represented by these images, it might be tempting to use a vocabulary of more or less. It makes sense to say that John Wayne looks more masculine than Robin Williams. We might imagine an ideal masculinity characterized by physical toughness, decisiveness, a taciturn quality. While Robin Williams isn't exactly girly, he does not possess these qualities in the same measure. In particular, he shows a playfulness you cannot call macho. So one might call him less manly than John Wayne. If, however, I offer this comparison, a vocabulary of more and less may not seem the best way to describe the difference. Of the two masculinities here, one is much more emphatically muscular than the other, although not necessarily more masculine. You could call both tough, decisive, and taciturn, but they are not the same kinds of men. The difference might lead us to speculate about a history of masculinities. We might think about how masculine ideals have shifted over time. Or we might think about differences in film genre, different film genres like the boxing film and the Western, having a different kind of hero. This way of approaching gender difference seems particularly called for by many of the costumes in the Cut exhibit. Here's Casanova again. Are these both manly men? It depends, I suppose, on your point of view. Casanova, through costume and makeup, asks us to take in the possibility that the coordinates have shifted, although the little bubbles on the bottom of the slide assure us that he does manly things, just like some 20th century person would do. If I add this comparison, we have to confront something else again. Two manly men here, but one sort has often been construed as a threat to national welfare, while the other has been often presented as a guardian of it. We can describe the white version as the norm. How should we describe the black version in relation to that norm? Sometimes black masculinity is described as threatening because it is perceived or presented as hypermasculine, that vocabulary of more or less again. But that description seems wholly inappropriate to Denzel Washington's star persona, which cool control seems to be a key feature of that persona. So we might do better not to measure masculinities according to a single yardstick, no pun intended there, but rather think of them as different data points clustered around an historically shifting norm. This idea of the mental image of a gender scatter plot, which I'm trying to evoke here, becomes even more relevant when we add femininity to the picture. In Miss Congeniality, you know both these films, right? Okay. In Miss Congeniality, I'm going to tell you the plot anyway, but just a little. Sandra Bullock plays an FBI agent who acts like one of the guys until she has to go undercover as a beauty pageant contestant to expose a murder plot. In order to perform what we are asked to see as a masculine professional role, FBI agent, she must learn to act like a woman beauty pageant contestant. We see this to be a painful and arduous process, like it is. In the end, predictably, she learns a valuable lesson about life, makes peace with femininity, and finds her romantic and professional prospects greatly improved. In Gravity, Sandra Bullock plays a woman who happens to be an astronaut on her first trip out. We spend most of the film rooting for her character to perform as an astronaut, so she can return to Earth alive. Miscongeniality encourages the yardstick approach. Masculinity and femininity are imagined as opposite ends of a continuum. There is a just right point marked for each, which one might approximate successfully, fail to measure up to, or overshoot. The film's humor comes from those failures. Its resolution arrives when Bullock's character seems to get it just right. Gravity, in contrast, isn't worried about getting gender just right. We never doubt that Bullock plays a woman, but there are many shots, as here, where showing her to be a woman is much less important than showing the predicament she faces. It would have been easy, for instance, for costume and makeup to exaggerate lips, waist, and hair, but the filmmakers went a different way. Audiences might not be able to see Bullock's character as just an astronaut, but we don't have to see her as a lady astronaut either. While one can say that she is more feminine than the ideal or normative astronaut, portrayed as a self-sacrificing veteran by George Clooney, the gender difference is not what the filmmakers chose to highlight. Gender itself is less strongly marked in the image. So if miscongeniality gives us, say, an x-axis along which more or less strongly masculine and feminine performances are arrayed, gravity indicates that there is also a y-axis, according to which the expression of gender might be more or less intense. This axis suggests the possibility that gender distinctions might matter less than other distinctions. We can bring that insight back to miscongeniality and observe that its jokes work by exaggerating gender performances, hyperbolizing and ironizing them, as in the poster for the film, which gives us a tight pink dress over combat boots. There is also, in addition to these examples, a whole intriguing set of trans possibilities where we might see traits we could otherwise recognize as feminine and masculine reconfigured in new combinations. But maybe the examples I've given you so far are enough. The point I want to be making is this: no one interested in the history of gender or its possible futures can assume that a continuum running through an idealized masculinity to an idealized femininity exhausts all the options. There are many different ways of doing masculine and feminine. There are ways to dial back on both so that neither seems as important, or to exaggerate to make their importance seem ridiculously outsized. So, more than two genders. Gender is established by conventions that filmmakers can use and manipulate on screen by, for example, working with costume and makeup. And these choices not only affect how we perceive gender, they reverberate throughout the scene such that we might see wholesomeness or understand that we're looking at a different time and place. Gender on screen is rarely only about gender. It also creates a fictional world and guides our interpretations of it. Would you like to practice with a clip or two? All right. Here's another costume from the exhibit. It's a pristine landscape, and with the man wandering around in it. At this point in the film, the filmmakers do a smart thing. You know, they have the ships at the beginning of the film. I don't know if you remember it, seen from the point of view of native people on the shore. So you know from the beginning of the film that they're not entering a really empty world. Yet we often see from this character's point of view the perception that is a blank new landscape. And then you said you see the man and the woman. Why does that matter? How does that work? She's presented as a feature of the landscape, right? She's kind of embedded in the grass there, and everything about the costuming and this framing conspires in that, so that we're schooled from the beginning to think that she's some kind of allegory for the new territory. Yeah. Isn't it amazing how kind of efficient a few shots can be when we're schooled in the conventions? I want to show you one more clip from this film for purposes of comparison. But you said he's kind of a rugged, masculine guy. Does he? I mean, we know the film is set centuries ago, but does this seem a particularly antiquated costume? No. I mean, you maybe wouldn't find it off the rack, but if you got rid of those frilly things on the shoulders, you know, right. Okay. Let me show you the next clip.
And in their wild meanders flow.
Okay. New World, Old World. This is the beginning of the last third of the film where she goes back and sees what do we know through costume and gender conventions about the old world. So I asked you about, did the Colin Farrell's costume look more contemporary or antique in the first clip, so that we could have this insight that one way we recognize that this is a past, decidedly bygone era is through these costuming choices about gender. One of the ways we recognize that the new world is new is through a different set of costuming choices about gender, which simultaneous lets us see, wow, kind of looks more modern ways of dressing people up than this, and also invokes the kind of primitive Adam and Eve encounter. An interesting kind of mashup. The color coding is kind of interesting. She's red, the king and queen of England are gold, and he's got a splash of red, but almost everybody else is in black and white. So there's a different principle of distinction going on here than the gendered one. We're seeing royalty versus court or something like that through the... Yeah. Clerics. Yeah. Okay, so see how fun this is? Yeah, you can do this on your own all the time now. Okay. I want to pick up the comment from the back that this is there was a little bit of classic Hollywood scenario where the man is the active looking fellow and the woman sort of appears as a picture. This is another way of thinking about gender on film. It's not so much about what we're looking at, but how we're instructed or directed to look. One idea about this, a common one, is that we're instructed to look from a masculine point of view. This is the famous male gaze that you may have heard and read about. And Hitchcock is widely regarded to have filmed the textbook on this. So let's look at a sequence from Vertigo. Do you know the plot of this film, kind of? I'll refresh you. The man who's with Kim Novak's character has hired, she's acting funny is the idea, and he's hired Jimmy Stewart's character to keep an eye on her. But that's kind of beside the point, right, in this scene. What do we see here? The camera moves in a way that mimics Jimmy Stewart's look more than hers, right? He glances over his shoulder and the camera swoops around the restaurant. She's framed there with her bare back, and she looks unlike anybody else. Our attention is captured by the costuming. The camera picks her up as she's walking out the door. We can kind of understand that as Stewart's point of view, maybe, maybe not. And then by the time she gets into profile, you know, the lighting effect changes. We really see her as a kind of iconic image of femininity, right? So Hitchcock's hitting us over the head with something that's pretty conventional in Hollywood film. The man is the guy who looks, the woman is the object of erotic interest. This continues in this sequence. He follows her around the next day. And we get to a couple pretty interesting shots. You had a cart like that? So far, it seems like maybe he's just doing his job. What do you make of that image? It's a kind of reprisal of what we just saw in the restaurant. She appears as a beautiful to look at picture. He's the guy who's looking. There's a little something something extra in this one. Kinda, yeah. And where's he? He's kind of stuck in that door. It kind of looks a little peeping Tomish. Yeah, it's a little creepy. This is one of the film's first suggestions that this is not going to be a healthy relationship. It's not going to work out very well for him. Kim Novak's character is going to get killed off not once but twice. Hitchcock's pretty good at taking, in this film and some others, and taking what's a pretty conventional way of representing gendered-looking relations and starting to find a perversity in them, and to maybe suggest to audiences, hint to audiences that the ways they have of looking at the screen might be, the normal ways of looking at the screen might be a little perverse. This paradigm, this way of thinking about gendered looking relations, the way we look through film at the screen, the assumption, the idea that, as Lauren Mulvey says, Hollywood provides a world cut to the measure of male desire. That way of thinking about film was really powerful and common for decades after 1975, when Lauren Mulvey wrote her essay, Visual Pleasure in Narrative Cinema, but came to seem kind of reductive. That is, in terms of imagining a strongly masculine position that other people had to awkwardly fit into, it didn't do so well at accounting for how Hollywood succeeded so dramatically in getting so many people of different genders, ethnicities, orientations into the theater in the first place, which we know it did historically. There's a lot more to say about this, but I want to give you one example that might suggest a complicating wrinkle. And this is the gay love scene that Charlton Heston doesn't know he's in from Ben-Hur. We know, thanks to Vito Russo's work, that it was both a historically available reading, that gay audiences in 1959 could perceive this as a kind of hidden or secret love scene between the two men, and that script ghostwriter Gore Vidal and the actor Jack Hawkins and the director William Wyler are all kind of in on that. Charlton Heston isn't in on that.
I said I'd come back. I never thought you would. I'm so glad. Look at you. Look at you. You've come back a tribune. When I heard that news, I drank a toast to you.
We'll drink another now. Your sister and mother, how are they?
They're fine. They've talked of nothing but you for days, ever since we knew you were coming.
Isn't his marriage yet?
Suitors come and go, but she dreams. You know, she's been in love with you ever since she was 5 years old.
Can't wait to see them. Do you still hunt jackals and lions? Or have you become too dignified?
I bring it up because the straight reading, straight way of seeing this is available too, right? But both ways of seeing this or investing desire in this sequence are possible.
Down, Eros, up Mars.
Down, Eros, up Mars. Are the beams crossed?
We might think of Hollywood as extraordinarily deft at allowing those kind of multiple engagements while working with the similar set of norms and conventions. Best friends or star-crossed lovers, you decide.
After all these years, still close.
in every way. I hope so.
Okay, now they're about to talk politics, and that isn't so interesting. This brings me to my third and final subheading. I think we're right on time to have some questions. I'll be brief with this, but this is kind of an area of research of mine, so I thought you might as well get your dollar's worth and hear about that. We can also talk about a gender division of labor when we talk about gender in film, and here you have Jacqueline West, who did the costumes for The New World, and Terrence Malick, the director, and Jenny Beavan, who did the costumes for Casanova, and Lasse Hallström, the director. And what do you notice about these people? Yeah, costume designer is a job women get to do, and director is a job maybe that men get to do. How does this happen? I became interested in the Universal Film Manufacturing Company, which is kind of remarkable because in the mid-teens, your chances of directing for Universal as a woman were about as good as they are now. That is about 10%, roughly 10% of Universal titles at their peak were directed by women directors, depending on how you count, and historical maximums in the U.S. film industry are around 12%, right? Hasn't gotten much better than that. Universal is interesting because this phenomenon happened on the cusp of the development of the institutions of Hollywood we have now. So Universal is a huge major film company in from 1912 to 1918 when the film industry is growing. But after 1917 or 1918 or so, it doesn't look like the dominant model. It becomes one of the little three because it doesn't own a theater chain. And the future at that point belongs to companies like Paramount, which do own theater chains. Around the same time, the women directors disappear. So there are a few women-directed titles in 1918, some, I guess, a release or so in 1919. By 1920, they're all gone. So it seemed interesting to me that in a moment of change in the film industry, it was possible. You could even imagine a company had a kind of pipeline going for women directors, and then that kind of abruptly shut down. And I wanted to try to understand how that happened, because we like things that make the state of affairs we've got not seem inevitable, right? We might want to imagine that things could be different. So here are two of the historically famous women directors, Cleo Madison and Ida Mae Park, and this is the cover of my book with another, Grace Cunard, on the cover. The most famous of the Universal women directors, Lois Weber, is not pictured here, but she was by far Universal's highest grossing director, and really as famous as D.W. Griffith in the mid-teens. So how does it happen that women get into the director's chair, and what changes to close that occupation to them, at least in Universal? There are a lot of people working on this period, and here's a great website if you want to learn more about it, the Women Film Pioneers Project at Columbia. And you'll see that they're interested in all kinds of behind-the-screen roles for women, including costume designer. If you click costume designer, you get some interesting results. And you see that a lot of the women who were credited or were known to be costume designers also had a lot of other roles in production. And this is one reason for the phenomenon, not just at Universal, but across the industry globally. Work roles were a lot more flexible. It was easier to wear multiple hats, to move from one role to another. But that phenomenon doesn't explain the concentration of women directors at Universal. So to explain that, I had to start thinking about things that might be specific to the company. And one of them is its kind of corporate map, its corporate geography, the way it imagined itself. This is how Universal City looked, same site as if you go to Universal Studios, City Studios in Hollywood now, where if anybody's been out there, where the legend of the map now is where all that City Walk stuff is out there. And the lot to the left of your screen is where all the sound stages are. And then if you take the studio bus tour, if anybody's done that, you go to the back lot, which is shown on the right-hand side of your screen. And that's where a lot of, westerns, serials, there's the zoo out there, there's the stables out there, a lot of kind of location-y type stuff was shot out there. It was a city that kind of imagined itself as a live-work-play space. Although not a lot of people ever lived there, the company promoted itself as a place, the city as a place where people would live. And it had an interesting kind of progressive attitude towards its fake, because it wasn't really incorporated as a city, officers. So here's Laura Oakley as police chief. Lois Weber was mayor. There was an advertisement of the city space as a kind of interesting progressive experiment involving experimentation around gender roles. And this was reflected in a lot of the film production in the middle of the teens, so particularly in the serials. So the big genre of the teens was the serial, think of something like Alias, if you know that show. Short installments, 20 minutes a week. You could read the story in the paper on the weekend before, but a lot of variety, and the constant variety in the plots, a short chapter every week. So just like serials today, they have a lot of fun with costumes. I mentioned Alias because if you know that TV show, they have a lot of fun with costumes in that show. So here's Grace Cunard, their most famous serial star, undercover in masculine attire, but also dressed up on the shoot for Lucille Love, Girl of Mystery. A lot of playfulness around gender roles in the serial plots. But that wasn't the only thing that was going on. There's a lot of other stuff going on, including some kind of heavy sociological examinations of poverty and women's poverty in particular. Lois Weber directed a whole series of films kind of on that theme. A lot of variety. Universal's releasing a daily change program, so every day it releases 4 or 5 short films to theaters, more like television maybe than movies today. So plenty of opportunities to get a shot, and flexible, a willingness to experiment with all kinds of plots. Here's Grace Cunard in Peg of the Circus, one of her last serials in Japan. She was, like all the serial queens, she was internationally famous. Okay, so what starts to change after, around 1918 or so at Universal is you'll see a lot of the shorts brands kind of go away, and instead you have feature film brands. The industry is shifting to what's called the feature film program, where you might see a cartoon or a short before the feature, but then you have the feature film. Here the plots become more like feature film genres we have today. They're more star-driven. There's a little bit less experimentation with plot variety in the formulas. And women directors get increasingly pigeonholed into a particular genre, which is called in marketing women's films. And this is almost always a story about avoiding scandal and marrying well. And almost always features fashions. So women are being represented, understood in the marketing anyway, as experts at the fashion bit and at this kind of plot. Right? Fewer films, riskier, more invested in each of them because they're longer. Women get pigeonholed into particular genres. Universal City kind of loses its experimental razzle-dazzle. It's no longer making so many films a week, so less activity going on there. These are the factors that I think cause Universal's pipeline of women directors to dry up. So the thought I'd like to leave you with about this is this is an instance where the development of on-screen conventions for representing gender ended up, including some marketing conventions, ended up shaping the off-screen conventions for gendered work. We usually think about it going the other way. In other words, it's the gender division of labor behind the screen that determines maybe how gender is represented on the screen. This is a case where I think we can also see it working the other way. The way genres started working and executives at Universal started interpreting them shaped who could do what kinds of jobs behind the screen. So with that, I think I've left 10 minutes for questions if you would like to ask them, and thank you very much.